Oh, Canada, our home and native land. Now, I have to say, I'm a huge fan of our neighbors to the north as they have contributed some great things to the world of professional wrestling, such as my absolute favorite style of wrestling to ever exist, which is the topic of this episode. Because today, I want to take this time to give a shout out to my supporters over on Patreon, like you, Matt Brummett, and you, Caleb Robinson. Thank you so much. Canadian Strong Style is a name designated to a specific kind of professional wrestling, but this moniker didn't take hold until the popularity of Japanese Strong Style started to spread. And to be clear, Japanese Strong Style is just Strong Style, period. But what makes this whole thing even weirder is that Canadian Strong Style wrestling is actually older than its Japanese counterpart. So how did this all happen? Well, as I've said in other episodes, when it comes to talking about professional wrestling styles, a lot of them just tend to have a lot of similarities with each other, as little bits and pieces will sometimes connect, whether intentionally or by accident. Now, sometimes this is because they all take turns influencing one another, or because they have a similar foundation, but this can also be because of something called convergent evolution. Okay, quick science lesson here. Convergent evolution is when two different species separated by time and or space develop similar traits to one another completely independently. But this doesn't hold true for just living organisms, because around the world and throughout the years of professional wrestling, in places like England, Japan, and yes, of course Canada, certain common principles began to emerge. Okay, so in order to make all this easier, I'm just going to quickly recap Japanese Strong Style wrestling. Now, I've already done an episode about this, so if you want a more in-depth look, just go ahead and check out that video after this one. But for this overview, allow me to start by saying that Strong Style wrestling was created by Antonio Inoki, and it's defined by using shoot holds and shoot strikes and incorporating them into a work performance, as well as putting an emphasis on submission wrestling with catch wrestling serving as the base. But on the reverse side of things, Canadian Strong Style was created by the legendary Stu Hart, who used the style himself during his time as a professional wrestler. And while these styles seem pretty different, they do also have some common ground. Both the Japanese and the Canadian versions of Strong Style have their basis in catch wrestling. And catch as catch can wrestling all began in jolly old England. Then from there, its influence started spreading all around the world to places like the United States. Following that, it would then go to Japan, since Japanese Purasu takes its cues from American pro wrestling. Both styles at their core were influenced by catch, which featured a focus on submission wrestling and catching your opponents with holds, also known as hooks, which is why catch wrestlers used to be known as hookers. But we don't call them that anymore, and you know what? It's a good change. Now, where the British part of this really begins to come into play is that some English teachings of catch can be very rough, like the training you would receive from the school known as the Snake Pit. And furthermore, allow me to specify that catch wrestling is a legitimate form of wrestling. It's not a worked system. While yes, it can be, it's still first and foremost used as a style of amateur wrestling, as it does also serve as one of the bases for MMA. So with the work version of catch wrestling serving as both the basis for Canadian and Japanese Strong Style, you can see where they start having some coinciding traits. Okay, so now that we've gone over the similarities, let's take a look at the differences between these two different pro wrestling styles. As previously covered, Inoki believed that Strong Style was a legitimate form of combat, and therefore some of what we see was developed as a shoot in order to back up that belief. On the other hand, Stu Hart believed that learning how to wrestle for real was the best way to have the most convincing looking performances as a professional wrestler. And that's what worked for Stu, as he first learned legitimate catch wrestling at the beginning of his career. When Stu Hart first learned wrestling, he learned in the old English way. His trainers would do things like putting him in a headlock until his face turned blue. Again, this was legitimate wrestling he was learning here. The thinking here was that this was first-hand knowledge of the effects of these particular holds, learning what precise amounts of pressure and applying it to specific parts of the body will do to an opponent. And these skills led to him winning amateur wrestling championships before he ever set foot in a professional wrestling ring, which he would eventually do while serving the Navy during World War II. And when Stu became a mentor himself, even though he was teaching a work style, he still taught students in the exact same way that he learned. However, there were definitely some that didn't subscribe to this way of training, as there have been a few students who have complained about this method, feeling like all they learned was how to get beat up. However, I should also point out that there are plenty more students out there who saw the value in this kind of training. And personally, I do feel that learning legit wrestling is the best way to create a realistic performance. And since many of my favorite technical wrestlers out there are Dungeon graduates, I have to say, I think the results speak for themselves. So just to reiterate, with Canadian Strong Style, you're using competitive grappling techniques in order to make your work performance look as good as it can, but always maintaining that it is a work. Japanese Strong Style, in contrast, just goes ahead and uses shoot techniques within the context of a worked match. So when you stop to think about it, it is kinda funny. Inoki was taught professional wrestling and then used that to create a shoot style. Stu, on the other hand, learned a shoot style and used that to develop the worked one. But despite having the opposite origin story, they eventually would converge and evolve into both being known as Strong Style. Additionally, another difference between Canadian Strong Style and its Japanese cousin is that the Canadian version doesn't focus as heavily on strikes. But that's not to say that strikes and/or martial arts techniques are completely devoid from the form, because they're not, as Lance Storm, among others, routinely use devastating kicks in their matches. And as far as punches go, Bret Hart is considered to have some of, if not the best working punches in the business. And on top of that, another great thing about the Dungeon was that Stu would sometimes bring in experts from other disciplines that he was not as well versed in. So from time to time, trainers like martial artists would come in to teach students things like strikes, but then they would hang around to learn a few things for themselves. So while strikes may not be a major part of the discipline, they do still indeed exist. However, going back to grappling, while both styles do have a foundation in hold-based wrestling, Canadian Strong Style does put a greater priority on submission holds. Lance Storm, Chris Jericho, Chris Benoit, Owen Hart, and Bret Hart all use submissions as their finishing maneuvers, where the King of Strong Style, Shinsuke Nakamura, uses a knee strike as his. And as far as the legacy of Canadian Strong Style goes, its reach echoes throughout the wrestling world in ways that not everybody is necessarily aware of. Because before the Performance Center or NXT or Florida Championship Wrestling or even Ohio Valley, Vince McMahon would send WWF wrestlers who he thought could use some additional training up to see Stu, which is why Attitude Era stars such as Steve Blackman and Mark Henry all spend time in the Dungeon. Oh, and also Brian Pillman, which explains how he was able to become a part of the Hart Foundation stable despite being an American. And even before that, starting at the days of Stampede Wrestling and going forward, a lot of legends of the business would receive some additional training through Stu, including Roddy Piper, Masahiro Chono, the British Bulldog, Fritz Von Erich, the Dynamite Kid, and many, many more. Because the great thing about professional wrestling is that you really never stop learning. Because at any point in your career, you can always pick up a thing or two in addition to the training that you've already had. Which is why Stu Hart was able to influence so many great wrestlers with his training. Also, even after Stu began stepping away from his teaching, some of his sons would open the Hart Brothers School of Wrestling, where trainers like Ed Langley and Brad Young would be the ones to teach notable talents such as Chris Jericho and Lance Storm. And even today, wrestlers like Josh Alexander and Nettie Neihart are keeping the style's legacy alive. And there's even a school called the Canadian Strong Style Wrestling Academy. In summation, Canadian Strong Style is a system of professional wrestling that teaches legitimate catch wrestling in order to make work performances seem as authentic as possible. A great style of professional wrestling to be sure, one that's definitely worth preserving and worth protecting, because in the end, oh Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Well, there you go, my favorite style of professional wrestling, Canadian Strong Style. But what's your favorite? Let me know down in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe right here to Dave Knows Wrestling. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, Dave knows